The file begins. The year 2026 was not supposed to be an ending. It was engineered as a resurrection. Instead, it became a posthumous audit. The comeback tour evaporated. The stadiums booked for a king's return became monuments to his absence, silent concrete tombs where echoes went to die. The brands that once clothed a generation were dismantled with the cold efficiency of a corporate execution, a digital guillotine. What remains are the obituaries of assets, the inventory of the wreckage. His fortune, once loud and aggressive, evaporated into a whisper on a balance sheet. Pause. A ghost number. This was the anatomy of the fall, and it was just getting started. The confession arrived not in the glossy pages of a newspaper, but through the cracked lens of a phone camera in the dead of night. He finally named his demon. A fatal error, he called it. An untreated bipolar disorder that had been the ghost in his machine for decades. He offered his diagnosis as a peace treaty to a world he had declared war on. Some saw a broken man begging for amnesty. Others saw a final, desperate gambit. The market, however, is immune to pathos. Sympathy does not reverse a financial cataclysm. The calls stopped. The entourage vanished. He was left alone in a minimalist palace surrounded by priceless objects that could no longer price his salvation. The silence in those rooms was different. It was not the silence of power. Pause. It was the silence of exile. But exile is a destination, not a beginning. To understand the verdict, we must first audit the crime. And the crime began in the noise. The grinding, hopeful noise of Chicago. Before the minimalist palaces, there was a small house filled with books and a mother's conviction. Pause. Donda West wasn't just a parent. She was the original architect of his ego, forging a belief system so absolute it bordered on a new religion. Its only deity was her son. He wasn't making beats on a dusty MPC 2000. He was drafting schematics for a world that would one day have no choice but to orbit him. The hunger was palpable. It wasn't for food, but for recognition. A ravenous need to transmute the concrete and neglect of the South Side into golden applause. This was the first fatal error buried deep in the foundation. The idea that love and worship were the same thing. Pause. The engine was built. It just needed a world to run over. The engine ignited in New York. Rockefeller Records wasn't a label he joined. It was a fortress he breached from the inside. They wanted beats. He gave them a manifesto wrapped in a pink polo shirt. The College Dropout wasn't an album, it was an act of defiance. A meticulously crafted rejection of the gangsta narrative that had turned the industry into a creative dead end. His success smelled of fresh vinyl and old resentment. Each Grammy was a brick for his future palace. Each platinum plaque, a shield. Then came the expansion. The anatomy of his ambition was never just about sound. It was about conquest. Fashion wasn't a side project. Pause. It was a second front in his war for cultural dominance. The Yeezy sneaker became the symbol of this new doctrine. A piece of rubber and fabric that held more value than a bar of gold, turning teenagers into disciples and sidewalks into runways. He built an empire on the novel idea that he was not a businessman, he was a god, and for a time, the balance sheets agreed. This was the peak, the view from the top of a monument built to honor a man who was still alive, a precarious, lonely place. But the air on that precarious, lonely place is thin. Silence is an enemy. To a man who equated attention with existence, the quiet of the summit was indistinguishable from the quiet of a tomb. And so, he began to scream. At first they were just provocations, the anatomy of a tantrum on a global stage interrupting an award show to enforce his own narrative of justice. A rehearsal. Then the screams grew louder, the grammar more broken. He offered history a new horrifying edit. Slavery was a choice. Each statement was a stress test on the foundations of his empire. The concrete began to crack. The MAGA hat was not a piece of merchandise. It was a lit stick of dynamite, a rokava oshipka that alienated half his kingdom and confused the other. The world watched, unsure if this was performance art or a public breakdown. It was both. This was the meat grinder of fame operating in reverse, spitting out the raw material it had once so eagerly consumed. His words were no longer bricks. They were stones he threw from the parapets, and the sound of shattering glass from below was the only applause he could hear. The bill for all that broken glass arrived. It was delivered by men in expensive suits who spoke in the cold language of contractual obligations. This was the posthumous audit of a living brand. The corporate gods who had once anointed him now orchestrated his formal izganani. The Gap partnership, a promise to clothe America, dissolved into a press release. Balenciaga erased his image from their campaigns, a digital exorcism. The final judgment came from Germany. The Adidas deal, the engine of his billion-dollar valuation, contained clauses about morality he had dismissed as boilerplate. They were not. His signature, once an asset class of its own, became Exhibit A in his downfall. The company that built an empire on his name now calculated the cost of severing it. The verdict was swift. In a single day, his status as a billionaire was revoked. Pause. 9/10 of his fortune gone. An empire turned to dust by the one thing he couldn't control: the fine print. The fine print was not the cause of death. It was merely the signature on the coroner's report. The autopsy of his finances began in the quiet hum of servers, far from any courtroom. Internal ledgers, never meant for public view, told a story not of a mogul, but of a gambler betting the entire kingdom on every roll. The flurry of new albums announced in 2025 was not a creative renaissance. It was a fire sale. Pause. Yage, Donda 2, the spectral Yandi. These were not records. They were attempts to issue new stock in a company that was already bankrupt. The album bully became the focal point of this financial death spiral. Its constant delays were not artistic indecision. They were symptoms of a hemorrhage. Whispers from inside the camp spoke of advances spent before the ink was dry, of distribution deals, like the one with Gamma being signed under duress, a cash infusion that smelled of desperation. The forensic accounting of his soul was even more revealing. The reported dating rule for his ex-wife was not the demand of a jealous lover. It was the panicked act of a CEO trying to prevent a hostile takeover of his brand's origin story, an attempt to place a lien on the past. He was losing control of the money, so he tried to copyright the memory. The internal rot soon seeped through the walls of the empire, poisoning the ground outside. The world, once his marketplace, became his jury. This was the anatomy of his international izgnani. The canceled tours were not logistical hiccups. They were geopolitical statements. The Rubicon Festival in Slovakia, a concert in Seoul. Each press release was a border slamming shut. A verdict delivered by festival organizers and governments who decided his brand was too toxic to import. His planned 2026 tour of India was not an expansion. It was a search for refuge, a desperate flight to territories where the exchange rate of his infamy was still favorable. The map of his influence was shrinking to a few isolated islands. Faced with a commercial quarantine, he executed his most cynical maneuver. The full-page apology in the Wall Street Journal on January the 26th, 2026. Pause. It was not a confession. It was a prospectus for a rehabilitated asset. The mention of a 25-year-old brain injury and a commitment to clean living were not pleas for empathy. They were liability clauses, a calculated rebranding of a man into a manageable risk, with his wife, Bianca, positioned as the public face of this crisis management. The price of re-entry was a public crucifixion of his former self, and he was willing to pay it. But the market has no soul. It only has a memory. The apology was a single sandbag against a tsunami of breached contracts and cascading lawsuits. The final months of 2025 were an anatomy of financial suffocation. The announced albums, Yage, Bully, The Ghost of Yandi, were not a creative renaissance. They were liquidation assets. His frantic flight to Johannesburg and Mexico City was not a tour. It was a search for non-extradition treaties for his capital. Name the deal with Gamma for Bully was celebrated by his remaining acolytes as a masterstroke. The documents, however, tell a different story. It was a surrender. A fire sale of his masters for pennies on the dollar to cover mounting legal fees. The 500,000 pre-saves on Spotify. A respectable number for any other artist. For him, it was a death rattle. A digital rounding error compared to the debts accrued. The empire was not just crumbling. It was being repossessed in real time, piece by agonizing piece. And then, silence. The aftermath was not a bang, but a long digital hum. The 2026 releases came and went, absorbed by the internet's relentless metabolism with a shrug. This was the Posthumous Audit. The final balance sheet showed a genius so profound it could only be matched by the scale of its self-destruction. The 25-year-old brain injury was not the reason for the fall. It was the flaw in the marble from the very beginning. A crack that spread under the unbearable pressure of a fame he engineered but could not control. His legacy is not in the music or the fashion or the billions he made and lost. His true, bitter legacy is a lesson. A public vivisection of a man who built a throne out of mirrors, then became enraged by his own reflection. We demanded a spectacle, and he, in his final catastrophic act of service, became one. The tragedy is not that he fell. The tragedy is that we all watched, and for a moment we were entertained.